Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just gonna wait a few minutes before we start. Okay, so we are going to begin. Hi, everyone again, and welcome to the Nuclear Ban Treaty, a Game Changer for Female Participation webinar. Welcome also to our two incredible speakers, Marisa Chan and Alicia Sanders-Sacre, who will be officially introduced later on. So this webinar is the first thematic webinar as part of our broader Feminist Leadership in Disarmament project, which includes webinar series along with research, opinion and blog posts, and a social media campaign. The objectives of this webinar are to raise awareness on the achievements and contributions of women working in the field with the focus of women from the Global South. We also aim to explore the challenges that women face as they enter and progress in the field of disarmament. For this particular webinar, we aim to discuss measures and ways on how the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons could help attain a more effective participation of women in nuclear disarmament, and also to examine the role of civil society initiatives shoring up female participation after the treaty has entered into force. We hope that this webinar will challenge the dominant gendered narrative and examine ways in which the treaty indicates a strong support for practical change. So first, Scrap Weapons is a campaign that suggests adopting international legal agreements as the basis for general and complete global disarmament. At Scrap, we are constantly developing research projects about disarmament, verification, emerging technologies, and of course, feminism in the field. And we hope to mobilize governmental, non-governmental, economic, expert forces in support of the same outcome. So briefly, my name is Marla, and I'm a member of the research team at Scrap Weapons, along with my colleague Yanis, and today together we will be moderating this webinar.
Thank you so much, Marla. I want to give a brief overview, very brief overview about the thematic objectives of this webinar, and would just like to start with the treaty itself, with the TPNW. Just a quick recap. I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with the treaty, but we just want to make sure that we are on the same page with that. So the Treaty on the Prohibitions of Nuclear Weapons is really a comprehensive nuclear weapons ban. It's been developed since 2010 and initiated through the disappointment of non-nuclear weapon states that nuclear weapon states would not fulfill the provisions under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That provision states that nuclear weapon states are obliged to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to nuclear disarmament. And the humanitarian turn is the object, or is what can basically be described as the beginning of this whole process leading to the ban treaty. The humanitarian term began in 2010 and led to the negotiations and adoption of the ban treaty in 2017. The ban treaty prohibits, and I quote, to develop, test, produce, manufacture, otherwise acquire, possess, or stockpile nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices, and it also includes IAEA safeguards and verification measures. After reaching 50 ratifications, the ban entered into force at the 22nd of January 2021. Why could the TPNW be feminist? I just want to give two very brief reasons. Ray Atchison, one of our speakers of the first webinar, stated in one of her papers that firstly, it shifts a discourse from deterrence to disarmament, from patriarchy to feminist and human-centered security. And second, the ban was achieved through the empowerment of women diplomats and activists from the global south. Our webinar aims to really explore these both elements, the discourses and the participation. That's why we invited a perspective from diplomacy, Marisa Chan, and a perspective from civil society, Alicia Sanders Sacra. To make sure that you're all familiar with Zoom, we invite you to put your questions in the Q&A down here. And please make sure to add which speaker your question then is directed to. And we will have the Q&A after our speakers had a brief talk.
Great, thank you, Yanis. So now I shall introduce our first speaker, which is Marisa Chan. Marisa Chan is an ambassador, deputy permanent representative of Costa Rica to the United Nations. She is an expert in peace and international security matters. She served before at the permanent mission of Costa Rica to the United Nations in New York. During her tenure at the United Nations, Ms. Chan was Costa Rica's arms trade treaty-led negotiator. She has also served at the permanent mission of Costa Rica to the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C., and at the Embassy of Costa Rica to the United States. In 2017, she returned to New York as part of the Costa Rican delegation to the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In 2018, Marisa Chan went back to Washington, D.C. as the head of the political section at the Embassy of Costa Rica. She has a senior speechwriter for the President of Costa Rica and has more than 20 years of experience as a professional writer. Marisa's presentation today focuses on the nuclear ban treaty and its role for enhancing female participation from a diplomatic discourse. Marisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here today. In September 2017, Costa Rica was a proud signatory on the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The ban treaty was, without a doubt, a landmark achievement in the signatories' common goal of nuclear disarmament, but equally remarkable was the inclusion of two gender-specific elements to the treaty. The first one in the preamble recognizes the proportionate impact on women and girls, including as a result of ionizing radiation, and the second mention in Article 6 recognized the need for gender-sensitive assistance without discrimination in victim assistance and environmental remediation. In its acknowledgement of the gendered dimension of nuclear weapons, the Nuclear Ban Treaty is lauded as the only gender-sensitive nuclear weapons agreement in existence. This is a good thing. Women and girls have never had the privilege of accepting themselves from the horrors or words of the violence of weapons. But for too long, women and girls were completely absent from the negotiating table and completely absent from the finished text of our collective efforts to mitigate these words and weapons. Indeed, in many cases, the effects of these weapons are felt disproportionately larger by women, yet their voices are often, even now, left unheard in the process of finding solutions to conflict. So the Nuclear Ban Treaty represents a massive step forward, but it's not enough, not nearly enough, to pat ourselves on the back and consider gender inclusion a finished task. The substantive text of the Nuclear Ban Treaty amount to just under 4,000 words. Of these 4,000 words, only 2 paragraphs, or just 111 words, deal directly with women and girls. That just about adds up to 3%. Yes, I counted it, and yes, I did the math. Of course, we cannot make gender inclusion just about the numbers, but I mention it to draw your attention to the fact that the treaty spends significantly more time discerning how state parties will equitably share the cost of hosting meetings and conducting its business than it does making space for women and girls. If the Nuclear Ban Treaty is going to be a game changer for female participation, we must take stock of where we are when it comes to the meaningful inclusion of women and girls and international peace and security. Gender remains a structural problem at the UN. The voices of women and girls have always been present, but often never truly heard. The elevation and success of some women and the inclusion of some female voices and perspectives does not remedy the fact that the voices of most women and girls remain secondary to the traditionally male-oriented narrative, politics, and power that is the foundation of the UN. Women and girls are ever present in the theaters of war.
We apologize for the technical problems, and we hope to carry on very soon. Let's just wait for a few seconds and hope that Marisa's internet connection will resume. Otherwise, we would carry on with Alicia. Okay, Marisa, you're back on. We cannot hear you at the moment. I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? And
yes.
where was I speaking? Where did I leave? Can you hear me now? I cannot hear you.
Oh, I can hear you properly. You were right at the statistical comparison of the time spent dealing with gender inclusion as opposed to regular conference duties of payments and states' contributions.
Okay, so let me go back. Okay. If the Nuclear Ban Treaty is to be a game changer for female participation, we must take stock of where we truly are when it comes to the meaningful participation and inclusion of women and girls and international peace and security. Gender remains a structural problem at the UN. The voices of women and girls have always been present, but not truly heard. The elevation and success of some women and the inclusion of some female voices and perspectives does not remedy the fact that the voices of most women and girls remain secondary to the traditionally male-oriented narrative of politics and power that is the foundation of the UN system. Women and girls are ever present in the theaters of war around the world as both combatants and diplomatic and NGO professionals at the UN. So why are we still having this conversation about gender inclusion? Why do women show up as less than 3% of what is universally acknowledged as a gender-sensitive perspective on nuclear weapons? The gender-specific elements of the nuclear ban treaty are seeds that have been planted at the result of the tireless labor of people who have largely existed behind the scenes, some of whom I recognize here as participants on this panel. Now it's the time to begin the work of growing these seeds of gender equity into a truly gender equitable future for the international peace and security. Now is the time to fully acknowledge the voices and contribution of women and girls. The nuclear ban treaty shows us only the beginning of how is it possible to create and write a more inclusive future. A future in which the voices of women and girls are leveled equally alongside those of men, a future in which the voices of women and girls are actually afforded the same level of respect and authority as the grand narratives of power that have traditionally informed our diplomacy. But how do we build this future from these seeds? First, women's participation and leadership. As you well know, the presidency of the 2017 UN conference was held by a Costa Rican woman. What you may not know is that the negotiating delegation sent by Costa Rica to the conference was composed entirely of women. This gender composition of the Costa Rican delegation was not by a specific design, it was by accident. But that in and of itself represents a core part of the problem. The inclusion and active participation of women needs to be by intention. In this sense, the Costa Rica delegation to the conference for the nuclear ban treaty was an anomaly. Under 25% of the delegations to the conference were headed by a woman. Just over 30% of the overall delegates to the conference were women. These numbers are not terrible and may be seen by some as a measure of success. However, research have shown that larger conferences of more than 100 people tend to have an outsized proportion of women compared to small forums that continue to be dominated by men. Indeed, if states can send one person to a meeting, they almost always send a man, which begs the question, why is it still the case that there's only space made for women after men have taken their seat at the table? We need to do more to challenge this stark reality. Women belong at the negotiating table, women belong in technical groups, women belong in fieldwork and inspections. So beyond adding to our numbers, how do we really challenge at the end the structure that has incubated this problem? Second, making real space for feminist perspectives and narratives. The participants to the conference of the Nuclear Ban Treaty did remarkable work within a rigid structure of existing power politics, a structure that has repeatedly treated women as token participants or treated women and girls as vulnerable victims of little consequential value. We must not underestimate the work that women did in negotiating the Nuclear Ban Treaty or their work in writing a gender-sensitive treaty text. But we cannot continue to expect women to simply walk into spaces from which they have traditionally been excluded and expect them to start talking the language of those who have traditionally excluded their voices. Introducing more women with peace and security specializations into their foreign service, it's a good start. Having more women enter with female diplomats and negotiators it's another step in the right direction. But this cannot be the only concessions to the problem of gender at the UN. If we are to fully acknowledge gender as a structural problem at the UN, our mentoring efforts must be more than teaching a select group of quota women how to make their way into a men's world. Yes, we must address the problem of women inclusion, but the burden of gender equity cannot fall solely on the shoulders of women who have been mentored into the old system. Mentorship must be about leading by example, showing the next generation of young women and young men that their contributions and their experience are not valued only in their relation to the traditional narratives of hard power politics. In this regard, the Nuclear Ban Treaty is a monumental step forward. An undergraduate student learning about nuclear disarmament in 2021 will see women's reproductive health written as a primary concern of nuclear disarmament. Imagine with me the impact of that inclusion in the next generation of scholars and diplomats who will continue this work when we are done. A seed has been planted indeed. Mentorship must be about more than making space for women or making sure that there are enough women at the room. It's about creating a space that is truly capable and honoring and valuing the experience and contribution of women and girls, including in meetings that are held virtually, and about creating a space for alternative approaches to international peace and security. The work is not done. We'll still have the road towards the first conference of state parties, and we need to get it right, especially for female participation. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Marisa. I think your presentation shows very, very well how treaties practically relate and also structurally relate to the participation, also to narratives within diplomacy, but also shows where, of course, there's also work to do. To the audience, please be reminded to submit your questions in the Q&A, and we will ask them after Alicia's talk. Alicia Sanders-Sacre is the Policy and Research Coordinator at the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. She is the author of over 100 articles, editorials, and reports on nuclear weapons, many on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and has provided expert analysis for news outlets, including The Guardian, Bloomberg, DW, and Newsweek. She's going to talk about the female participation of the TPNW from civil society perspective and how the treaty challenges a patriarchal narrative on nuclear weapons. Alicia, it's your turn.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really my pleasure to be here and to speak after such an insightful contribution from my fellow panelists. I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me a moment. All right. Nope, sorry. All right. So yeah, it's really, again, my pleasure to be here. I'll be talking about covering kind of a lot of what's been outlined about feminism, nuclear weapons, female participation, and specifically looking at the TPNW and civil society contributions. So first, just a little bit about ICAN for those who aren't familiar with us. We're a campaign of over 500 partner organizations in more than 100 countries. We're headquartered in Geneva, where I'm speaking to you from. And we have the common goal of banning, stigmatizing, and eliminating nuclear weapons. We were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for our work alongside many dedicated diplomats, of course, to achieve the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And now we're really focused on promoting adherence to, implementation, universalization of the treaty. I first want to just start out by kind of asking the question, why are we talking today about feminism and nuclear weapons? What's kind of the background here in terms of, again, both participation and the narratives that we hear about nuclear weapons? And a lot of this really ties back into the TPNW, but just to give a bit of a general overview. So starting out, it's been about a decade, and we've had a number of UN resolutions addressing different aspects of women and disarmament. And, first, of course, with the landmark UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which really tied gender into all aspects of Security Council action, including, of course, disarmament. In 2010, there was another UN Security Council resolution looking at women, disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. And then a UN General Assembly resolution in 2012 as well. And so all of this kind of preceded, of course, the TPNW and kind of built up some of this discussion and narrative within the UN. One, a kind of clear link in terms of why do we need to talk about women and feminism when we talk about nuclear weapons is looking at the impact of nuclear weapons. And there's a clear disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on women and girls. And there's a number of examples. Sorry, this is a bit text heavy, but just so you kind of have a lot of information here. There's been, really a lot of research looking into the disproportionate impact of ionizing radiation on women and girls who are more likely to develop cancer and other diseases due to exposure. And that comes from, studies from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as Chernobyl. There's the impacts that pregnant women face from nuclear radiation and the impacts on their children. And, what's really, I think, even more compelling and concerning about this impact is that there's also been research looking at how kind of we understand the impact of radiation, and that the model for understanding the impact of radiation on humans is often a man. And that really then leads to a misunderstood impact on women kind of as a whole overall. And I put in brackets, Mary Olson has written a lot about that. As I'll just kind of touch on this briefly because it's already been mentioned, but there's consistent underrepresentation of women, despite in some ways their kind of unique contribution to these discussions on nuclear weapons in diplomatic fora. And this is really across the board. And there's been a lot of research on this as well that I'm happy to share more, in addition to, of course, the experiences that really any diplomats or civil society who've been in the UN can share. And I think this really gets to, I think, the heart of the issue that's beyond, it really speaks to why we have to talk about more than just representation of women, as important as that is when we talk about feminism and nuclear weapons. Is really this at the heart of nuclear weapons and security, international security discourse more broadly, is this really skewed perspective of, what's rational and strong, and what security is, that values weapons and devalues cooperative human security approach. Really to the detriment of global security, peace and security. I just put one kind of historical example of how this approach can really threaten initiatives to pursue disarmament, to pursue common security. This is a historical example, but of course we hear kind of tripes like this all the time about people who want to pursue disarmament I think every woman certainly, and most people who are working and pursuing disarmament might have been told they're not serious or they're emotional. I think Ray Atchison spoke about this in the previous panel in this series, but there's really no shortage of examples here. And I think it's really important to tackle this perspective head on if we really need to make progress on disarmament. So that kind of brings me to the TPNW, and I certainly agree with what my previous panelists mentioned about the fact that the TPNW is certainly a step forward, but it's not the be-all, end-all solution. There's still a lot of work to be done. So I do want to emphasize that, while also pulling out a little bit of what we tried to do differently on the TPNW when it came to how nuclear weapons and gender and participation. So I will just go through this. So first, I think that looking at the civil society angle, it really is a long, incredibly inspiring history of women from around the world, and particularly women from Indigenous and impacted communities who've spoken out about the impact of nuclear weapons. This is not a new thing, and it's really, one thing that's very empowering to be a part of the ICAN movement is to continue to kind of build on this long history of women who have spoken about the need to disarm and really brought a human perspective to these issues. So I've just put a few pictures here. One is a compilation of women from the Pacific who spoke out about their experience and activism with nuclear weapons testing and efforts for nuclear-free Pacific. This is the portrait of 3 different Hibakusha women who survived the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, who have become really leading activists in the abolition of nuclear weapons. And then here, this is a picture of Helen Caldecott, who founded Physicians for Social Responsibility in the US and was really known for delivering these very powerful, very human speeches about what would actually happen medically when a nuclear weapon is dropped, in terms of, in kind of graphic details, what these weapons actually do, pulling back this curtain of, security, deterrence, to really give you the truth about nuclear weapons. And I think this is something that all of these women have done, and speaks to linking not just why female participation is important, but also the importance of new perspectives and human perspectives. So we certainly saw the continuation of female leadership in civil society in the movement to ban nuclear weapons and get the TPNW. So here, this is just a photo of several ICAN campaigners outside the United Nations in New York. And then we have Beatrice Finn and Setsuko Thurlow accepting the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICAN after getting the treaty. And so again, I think following on this legacy of female participation, elevating the humanitarian perspective, that was really core to achieving the TPNW. As was mentioned in the introduction, the series of humanitarian conferences that preceded the TPNW, and of course, within the treaty itself. So this was also mentioned already, but I just wanted to have a chance to show you what we saw in terms of impact of this process of really featuring female perspectives and the humanitarian kind of element of security. And in the preamble, of course, we have the references that were mentioned already. Really groundbreaking in terms of international law on nuclear weapons. I think this is a good example of how the process can really change the product. And then, of course, with Article 6, again, on providing assistance for victims of nuclear weapons use and testing and remediating contaminated environments, which at its core is, centering again the survivor, the human experience, the human impact of nuclear weapons, and of course, picking up the importance of gender-sensitive assistance. So, to conclude, I think I agree that we've seen that, there's still a huge problem in terms of the dominant narrative on nuclear weapons, and the TPNW hasn't magically changed that. But it does provide a really important new and fresh perspective on feminism and nuclear weapons and human security. And joining the TPNW really represents an important step forward in terms of recognizing the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons and the leadership of female survivors from around the world on nuclear disarmament. And it's an important step for all countries to take. I think, again, going forward, certainly we need to continue to work to ensure there's strong female participation and not just, not just women from the global north, but really representative female participation within the next meetings of the treaty as it advances and goes forward. And that continues. I think it will be an ongoing effort, and we can't forget about it. And then just to also conclude that, again, we see the TPNW as really a revolutionary step forward, but there are also many other kind of existing international fora where disarmament and nuclear weapons are discussed, and so it's important to bring this approach, a feminist approach, to all relevant international fora. So with that, I look forward to taking more questions.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you. It's really amazing to hear this great insights on the TPNW, and thank you for your contribution and for shedding particular light on the role of civil society in leading the treaty to further accomplishments. So we will now request the audience to add some questions through the Q&A function. We will have 2 initial questions, and then we'll proceed to the Q&A afterwards. We would like to start with Marisa. So Marisa, by mentioning the idea that there might be strong participation of women, however, the challenge is how to make sure that their voices have been heard. So how do you think the TPNW could help in addressing this particular challenge?
I think that we can do that now by setting the right foundations and structures towards the first conference state parties to ensure that the mandates that are enshrined in the text of the treaty are upheld and respected and honored by the state parties and by those who may join afterwards. I don't think that the job is done. We have a long way to go. We have 1 year towards the first conference state parties, and there is where we can ensure that we honor the treaty text and the promises that were written in it.
Thank you so much, Marisa. Next question from our side is for Alicia. Alicia, we spoke about feminism, but I want to ask a more concrete question. How important do you think is an intersectional understanding of feminism for the TPNW, especially also considering the role of post-colonial perspectives?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's absolutely critical. And we've seen, I mean, I spoke about the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on women and girls, but we've also seen certainly the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on Indigenous people and peoples of color due to where nuclear weapons were tested and even where they were dropped. And I think that is such a critical perspective, and those who have direct experiences with the impact of nuclear weapons are the real experts of nuclear weapons and who should be centered in conversations about disarmament and about these weapons. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think it's about having representative perspectives that are not, concentrated in one gender or one region of the world or one race, but that are really reflective of the global community and the global security that we need.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Also, interesting questions are coming up in the chat. So I'm going to take the first one addressed to Marisa. Why do you think that the percentage of texts about women and girls is that low? And were so many passages cut, or were they never drafted in the first place?
Because it's always a struggle to include gender text in treaties. And I saw that during the negotiations of the Arms Trade Treaty, when it was a fight between states to include gender-based violence as a consequence of the illicit transfer of weapons to certain countries. It's always a battle. It's not something that negotiating, that is not in the mindsets of people with security backgrounds. Having a human security approach to weapons, it's something that this treaty does, but it's just the beginning. It's very hard when you have people with different mindsets of what security means, and that translates to treaty text. That would be my answer.
Thank you so much. The next one is by Anna for Alicia. Alicia, what thoughts do you have regarding some global powers, for example, the Biden administration, and the discourse on nuclear weapons and gender inclusivity in this regard and in these global powers and administrations?
Sure. I mean, I think I've spoken a little bit about the dominant discourse on nuclear weapons and what's problematic about it from a feminist perspective. And this relates certainly to how the United States thinks and speaks about nuclear weapons, in that, claiming that nuclear weapons can provide or do provide security for the United States really overlooks who nuclear weapons do not provide security for. And that's people within the United States who live near nuclear weapons laboratories that are still contaminated from nuclear weapons production, or near former test sites who are suffering from the impacts of nuclear weapons tests decades ago. The downwinders in the United States as well, who are still suffering really tragic rates of cancer in their communities due to the impacts of nuclear weapons testing. I think it's just this conceptualization of security that ignores the most impacted within a country and within the global community. That's really problematic, and is really why we need to approach the nuclear weapons conversation and disarmament discourse with a feminist perspective, with a common and human security lens, to truly understand what actually does provide security for any given country and for the international community.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. And I think it's crucial to think about the risks in order to move from the security understanding and moving from state-centered approach to human-centered approach, and to see what are the risks of these nuclear weapons. Thank you for these insights. And the next question is to Marisa. Could you expand on women and meaningful participation in diplomacy and UN deliberations, so as opposed to having women merely for the numbers, and how to enhance their participation. How can male counterparts contribute to ensuring that women take leading roles in diplomacy?
Personally, I believe that sometimes the feminist discourse have been held by a group of countries from the global north, and their work has led the way for many of us from the global south to replicate those voices. But the feminist agenda does not belong to a regional group. It belongs to all of us. And as I've read the work of one of the participants in this panel, I love the perception of the notion of being part of the resistance. And as a woman, you are born as part of the resistance. As a diplomat from the global south, I'm also part of the resistance. As a country does not have nuclear weapons and that values its security and interprets insecurity in terms of human security and invests more of its GDP in education and health than many of our neighboring countries, we try to convey that into what we understand of as the feminist approach and also the participation of women. And that means creating alliances, working with other female diplomats from the global south, and making sure that we support each other on the negotiating table, that we support each other vocally when we are negotiating treaty texts or resolutions, and that we create a front in which we are able to have our own say, because there is no exclusivity in this fight. It's our fight. It's something that women from the north and the south have to do together. So creating alliances, working with other delegations, that's key. And sometimes when it comes to the male counterparts, sometimes they do recognize your contribution and they step aside or say, this is the person who's leading with that process. And sometimes it doesn't. What you can do is vesting. And I think that's my best advice to anyone, and particularly for women. If you work with excellence, if your work is pristine, if you show up early and leave, and you do your job well, it's undeniable that you will be called to the negotiating table, that you will call for a delegation because you have done your job. And also, having someone that recognizes that there's value added in bringing you to a group or a delegation, but it means also working in cooperation and not in competition.
Next we have, thank you, Marisa. Next we have a very, very connected question, I guess, from Mehdia. I'd like to give to Alicia. So Alicia, what are some of the specific challenges you have as a woman in civil society diplomacy in all the disarmament forums? And what are the things you suggest one can do when you're in a space where there are male individuals who inhibit your chance to speak or may make it difficult for you to fully participate? And Marisa, if you want to add something as well after that, feel free.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess speaking from personal experience, I think in many ways I've been very lucky that in every organization that I've worked, I've had really excellent female colleagues and mentors and supervisors who have really acted as real helpers to me in terms of elevating my own opportunities and experiences. So I think that, certainly just speaking from a personal perspective, it is really helpful to be able to find kind of a female mentor who you can kind of ask questions and who can help push you forward in a way. But I think it's also partly about kind of recognizing your own intelligence and value and contribution to the conversation. I think there can be a number of factors, but sometimes it can be a bit intimidating to want to contribute or to speak up. And I'd say, do what you can to try to do that. But I think, outside of that, certainly finding a mentor can be very useful. But I would say I haven't. I've been very lucky to be surrounded by, as I mentioned, in civil society, Disarmament civil society. There are a lot of really, really strong female leaders. So I've been very lucky to be surrounded by them for most of my career.
Thank you, Alicia. Really great tips to encourage women to participate in such environment. And then we move to a more practical or particular question to Marisa. What are some concrete steps that states can take to address the structural inequality at the UN? At the same time, what are some concrete steps that the UN can take to address and resolve such representation issue?
There are several studies on the cascade effect, which means that permanent members of the Security Council have an advantage in appointing their people to senior level positions at the UN. It shouldn't be like that. It should be by merit. It should be an open and transparent process to find the best person for a job. So that's one of the structural problems that we face. And it's one of the proposals that Costa Rica has for the election of the Secretary General, or the process of selection of the next Secretary General, that this practice must change, that we need to ensure that the best people for the job are appointed. The current Secretary General has made the case for gender balance in senior posts, and I welcome that approach. But there's still certain positions that are just kept for the P5. So that's a structural problem at the United Nations. How can you break that? It takes time. Raising the issue is one step. Including it in the discussions of the processes like the revitalization of the General Assembly, on whenever we have an open debate at the Security Council on the working methods, or if the chance comes, we address it. But it's a long way to go, because the structures are there, and you need to be really, really smart and have to navigate those waters. But I think that you can do it respectfully, and someday they might listen.
Thank you. I think it's a really good step to speak out about that, as you did now, very openly, about what goes wrong in the UN. And I think that hopefully is the first step to real change. We want to proceed with Elizabeth's question. She thanks you for the enlightening presentations, and she says that she would love to hear from you both. In your experience over the past years, has the shift of many forums and conferences from in-person to online, both within the UN and in other institutions, helped or hindered women's participation and the effort to make their voices heard? And of course meant in the past year and in the past years. So yeah, what has COVID to do with all of that? Alicia, do you want to start, and then Marisa?
Sure. Yeah, I can kind of speak from the civil society perspective, in that I think there has been a lot of concerns about ensuring active and meaningful civil society participation in online fora. And, I think you do lose something when you're not all in the physical same place together, in terms of dialogues and exchanges that might happen more informally on a normal basis. That can be a bit more difficult to maintain in an online setting. So I don't know that it's specific to women, but perhaps given there's a lot of female leadership in civil society on weapons and nuclear disarmament issues, I think it is something that we're certainly monitoring and want to ensure that there is full and effective participation of women and civil society when it comes to future TPNW meetings, which hopefully will not be online. But yeah, it's certainly, I think, been something to monitor and be aware of.
I think it has improved because there are no costs associated with women traveling to meetings or conferences, and even at the Security Council, sometimes you hear their voices. I hope to see that in the next commemoration of the Women International Day on March 8th, and to hear the voices from women from the global south or Africa or Syria that haven't been affected by conflict. In a way, it has improved because the costs associated with traveling, with bringing one woman or another to a meeting decreased. But it's about connectivity. Are all these women able to connect to the internet? Are they networked? Are they part of a list of experts or people that you will call for information or insights? And that's something that we lost with the pandemic. Yeah, in-person meetings continue to be key and important to develop these relationships that you need when we are working towards like-minded states or civil society and together as one voice towards an end goal.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, more efforts is needed to just face the challenges that we are facing with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll move to the next question. How do you envision the discourse and narrative on international security and disarmament, along with the patriarchal understanding of it, that change with successful gender inclusivity? So Alicia, and then Marisa, if you can add anything on after Alicia, you're welcome.
Sure. I mean, I think this is really one reason why the effective and equal participation of women and women from around the world is so important. Is to really have an accurate dialogue, a representative dialogue on these issues, and to change kind of the conceptualization of nuclear weapons and security to one that's very, defined in a patriarchal kind of hard security way to more of this, as we've discussed, collective human security framework. And I think that certainly the participation of women, of impacted communities is so important to bring about that change in discourse. But of course, it's not really the only thing. There's also a lot of need for, and has been, a lot of kind of research on these problems and criticizing kind of the dominant security framework that helps to shape and change perspectives, as well as certainly activism to really get the message out there beyond diplomatic forum. So I think certainly this is, one reason why the participation of women is so important, is to bring a new perspective and to change kind of this problematic thinking about nuclear weapons. But we also need more than just that to change this discourse.
I see it in two levels. First, there's an obstacle, and it's the pandemic, which means that most resolutions will be technically updated, so there will be no discussion or inclusion of new paragraphs or proposals on the issue. Nevertheless, there's an advantage, and that's the role of civil society and tools like Reaching Critical Will, of the ICANN newsletters or publications on certain issues that are key to educating us, the states, on what is the important angles. And we members, and I can tell you this, member states read what you publish. Member states appreciate the angle, and that creates, and they listen. So there is an advantage right here, right now, to educate, convey the main points and issues that need to be raised once we are able to negotiate and introduce text to resolutions that need more than a technical rollover. The text of certain resolutions must be strengthened. And you can only do that if you have the time to identify those resolutions and to work coordinated with a group of countries that will push for those inclusions and defend it when the time comes. But you can only do that if you work together with other states, ideally within different regions. So it doesn't sound like something from just a geographical group, but it becomes a global concern.
Thank you so much. And I think it's really important also to stress this, working together of diplomacy and civil society. And I think this dialogue is a very good example of this. So we're going towards the end of this really interesting discussion. So we would just like to have one last question for you both before we wrap this discussion up. Let me ask the question for both of you. In order to face this strong opposition by dominant male and power narratives in the field of disarmament, we need a collective partnership of civil society and diplomatic actors. I think that's something we just spoke about as well. What do you think are the main strategies to achieve either cooperation, achieve a deeper cooperation, and how does the TPNW contribute to it, and is also a symbol of this cooperation? Whoever wants to start may start.
I can start. I mean, I agree. I think this the TPNW has been a really, really great example of cooperation between civil society and states, and it's been, a real joy and privilege to work so closely with so many dedicated diplomats on the treaty. This is something that I think will certainly continue and has continued past the negotiation of the treaty and into its implementation. ICANN works very closely with all states parties on, for example, ensuring that all states had submitted their declarations, which is an obligation under Article 2 of the treaty, and putting forward recommendations for how states can implement obligations on universalizing the treaty, for example, and thinking about implementing the positive obligations as well. And it's very much I'd say a close partnership. And I think in order to make that happen, a lot of it is really about relationship building And this is something that I really noticed when I came into ICANN, was really the importance on the kind of social aspects of relationships, and understanding that, you know, we're all people too, and it's important to get to know each other and to support each other and to work together beyond just, you know, negotiating any given article or implementing a given article. So I think it's really taking a relationship kind of approach to working relationships is so critical to have effective cooperation.
I think that we should continue to work as partners. Civil society has done a great job raising the level of ambition, and you must continue to do that. And as a state, I urge you to continue asking states to raise the level of ambition, because civil society is there to push us to do better, to be fairer, to be more inclusive. And I thank you for that. Also, you have civil society organizations play a major role in educating experts. And it's something that we truly need now on the road towards the next, to the first conference state parties. There's a new group of experts in New York, Geneva, and Austria that were not part of the negotiations. It's actually an anomaly that some of us are back. Most of them have rotated or going to different posts. So we need to raise the knowledge level of the experts, so we have substantive, ambitious, creative ways to set the structure for the next conference state parties. And this is the job that we need to do now.
Great inspirations. Thank you so much. And yeah, cooperation is needed more than ever today to face and to reject the dominant narrative. Unfortunately, we won't be able to respond to all of the questions, but we will answer them in the subsequent report after the webinar. We came to the end of our webinar. However, it's not the end of our discussion on feminist leadership in disarmament. This was the webinar 2 out of 7. And our next webinar of the series is on patriarchal structures in disarmament in 2 weeks. I invite everyone to join the next webinar, and you can find more information and the link to register on our website and social media. Many thanks to our amazing speakers, Marisa Chan and Alisa Sanders-Sacre, and to everyone who has joined us. I hope you found it thoughtful and interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.